Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. When we asked our listeners recently whom they would like to hear on our show, a number of them suggested that we invite David Rothenberg to be a guest. If you're a longtime WBAI listener, I'm sure you're already aware of his long list of accomplishments. He's been a Broadway producer and publicist, also a prisoners activist, the founder of the Fortune Society, which advocates for prisoners' rights and works with former inmates to aid them in adjusting to life after prison. He's also been a broadcaster on WBAI on and off since 1968. Gives me great pleasure now to welcome him to our show to talk about his amazing career. And a little later in the show, we will invite you to call in.
You're going to have callers?
Well,
all right.
David, they love you. The number is 212-209-2877. But hold off on that for a while. Let us have our own little conversation.
I figure when I got the call when I come on that Michael Cohen must have canceled and you need somebody last minute.
No, I think that we invited you because we thought that you'd be a good guest. What do you think? Wasn't it your childhood dream to become a sports writer? What happened?
It was. I was a sports writer. I became one in high school. In college, I became a stringer covering sporting events in New Jersey, Teaneck, for the Bergen Record. And then when I was in college...
The major newspaper of the area.
Yeah, and then in college for the Denver Post. And then I was in the Army. I was the sports editor of the Marne Rock, the 3rd Division newspaper, and became and made a little extra money on the side for the Columbus, Georgia Ledger.
But you also started writing about politics, especially in college. After you became editor-in-chief of the University of Denver undergraduate newspaper, the Clarion, wasn't a petition circulated that alleged that you were a communist?
Yes.
This is during the McCarthy era.
Period. I was chairman of Students for Stevenson, which was my communist credentials. And when I ran for editor of the paper and won, I defeated 2 fraternity guys, and I was not a fraternity person. And so that was breaking a cycle. Mm-hmm. And the best way to petition against me during the McCarthy period.
He's a communist.
I want to go back, though, to sports. Because
but I was going to ask you a sports question. You said your first political hero was Jackie Robinson.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
Who's a Republican. He was a Republican.
Well, when he was a second baseman when I became a fan.
Actually, when I saw him, and I'm not as old as you, but I'm still old.
No
when I saw him when he broke in with the Dodgers, he was playing first base.
Yes, he was.
His first season, he played first base.
The thing that, and I've tried to examine this about myself. Growing up in Teaneck, I was a Giant fan. The Dodgers were the arch enemy. And when Jackie Robinson, the first African-American player, I had such a passion about him making it. And most of my friends who were Dodger fans or Yankee fans didn't care one way or the other. And in hindsight, I'm trying to find out what was it, his being an outsider. And because of Jackie, and I watched all the perils that he went through. Ben Chapman, the Phillies manager, putting a black cat out on the field, him staying in separate hotels, the threats to Rachel and himself. I had such a passion about him. And the funny thing is, years later, he became a broadcaster at the local NBC, and I was a publicist at the time, and I always arranged guests to be on his show and got to know him. And one day he said to me, David, most of our guests are from the sports world or politics. You're the only one that brings in from the entertainment field. Why are we so lucky? And I looked at him, I said, because you're Jackie Robinson. And it dawned on me that obviously he knew that what he meant in the world, but for one single person, I don't know if he realized the impact that he had on people's lives that were life-changing.
Well, it wasn't just that he was the first African-American to play Major League Baseball, but he also was a brilliant player. He had charisma. He stole home a number of times.
7 times one year, set the record. But he was a nice man besides. And that counted.
And he was also he was good in the field as well. He was a great second baseman.
But when you said he was a Republican, he was a Rockefeller Republican. I'm sure if he had stayed around, that he was on the side of the Angels on a lot of issues.
Well, in those days, of course, the Democratic Party had a big Southern wing, and he was very, and the Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, and chock full of nuts made him a spokesperson, I think. But one of the big thrills in my life was getting to know him years later and to find out that he was the kind of man I hoped he would be. And my cousin, who was Marvin Miller, the union organizer, was very friendly with Jackie, and years later with Rachel, and always gave me information about the Jackie Robinson Foundation because he knew how important that was to me.
While you were at the Clarion, the undergraduate newspaper, didn't you expose the rape of fraternity boys at the university by Francis Vanderburg?
Well, yeah, that's quite a story.
He was the father of
Marilyn
former Mrs. America.
Well, you gave the end of the story. It really was kind of dramatic. As editor of the paper, I came in one morning and the phones were ringing that a co-ed had been raped at a fraternity party that Saturday night, which was Kappa Sigma, which was where all the athletes were. And I, as a newspaper person, started making calls and immediately got a call from the chairman of the alumni board. And I never tell his name when I tell the story. And then he sent a car for me, and he brought me down. He had all the trappings of big business, and he said, "We've got in the daily newspapers, they're playing ball, and we hope that the student newspaper will play ball because this girl's a tramp, and these are good kids, and the boys are good boys, and we don't want to hurt them." And I left there really bothered by that. And there was, this was mid-50s. There was no feminist literature. There was no, we hadn't been attuned to things that young people are now.
But rape is still rape.
But I had a sister and a mother and a grandmother and my Aunt Hilda, and they gave me a certain amount of values and understanding. And I wrote an editorial which in retrospect was rather tepid. And at graduation, when I graduated from college, by the way, the boy, nothing happened to the two boys, and the girl left school in disgrace. At graduation, this chairman of the alumni board was giving out the diplomas, and when I reached for mine, he dropped it. So it was petty and little.
You were a commie, that's
and
right.
And then years later, Marilyn Vanderburg, former Miss Colorado, former Miss America, said that she had been sexually abused all through her childhood by her father, who was this man, Francis Vanderburg, a prominent Denver businessman. And I thought, Jesus, it all came together.
That was squelched as well, wasn't it?
What?
Wasn't that story squelched at the time?
About Marilyn?
Yeah.
No, she went on Oprah and told the story.
Did you hope to pursue a career in journalism after you graduated from college? Well,
before the Army got a hold of me. I came to New York after college from Colorado and got a job as a mailboy at CBS, and then knew I was going to be drafted. And so I hitchhiked cross country. Got a job in Inherit the Wind in the Chicago company as a juror.
Mm-hmm. You wanted to be an actor?
No. A friend of mine was the assistant stage manager. I stopped by to say hello, and he said, "We need a juror." Mm-hmm. So I was, Melvin Douglas was playing the part of based on Clarence Darrow. And then I went to San Francisco. My father got in touch with me and said, "Your draft notice is here." So I flew back and then went into the Army. Then came to New York when I came out of 2 years of suffering in Georgia.
And you had given up the idea of being a journalist or an actor or whatever else? Because you did wind up in show business.
No, but when I saw the movie All About Eve in high school, and I heard the quick dialogue and the rapier wit, and I said, I want to be around those people. So when I came back, I took a series of terrible jobs. I can't remember all of them, one after the other. But in those days, you would read the New York Times employment section, and anything that said theater, I would send in a resume, and nothing happened until one day I got a call on it. It should have been a warning on a Saturday night saying, come in for an interview on Sunday morning. Mm-hmm. And it was a press office in the Stardy's building. And I worked in the theatrical press office.
And you met some of the biggest names in show business.
Well, you know what? My Aunt Hilda, said, make yourself indispensable if that's what you want to do. And I was hired for the summer because they had 6 or 8 summer tents, and I was. By the end of the summer, they couldn't fire me because I was the person in the office that knew where everything was and knew everybody's phone number and knew who to call about what. And it was when I asked about am I leaving, they looked at me as if no, you're working here. And I was always working till 8 or 9 o'clock at night in the Sardi's building, and people would stick their head in and.
That was the Sardi's building.
Yeah, and what I learned was that your once you get the job, your resume is your job performance. And people started asking me if I was making $65 a week, working 6 days a week, and not allowed to go out for lunch. And people were saying, "Come work for me. I'll pay you $85 a week, and you can have lunch." And I find. A man named Bob Ullman said, I have a show opening, and if it gets the kind of reviews that I think it will, I need you. And it was Little Mary Sunshine was the show.
Well, that area was hot.
It was fun.
It was also the Brill Building area where suddenly a whole new style of pop music developed. So, and that was partly because it was a theater area. Well,
there were no high rises. It was a community, and so you saw everybody that you knew, and you'd go into the eating places, and it was filled with other theater people and you got to know everyone.
Is it true that you were once Elizabeth Taylor's date, or at least her escort?
Her escort. Well, calendar pages flip by, and I'm working with Alexander Cohn, the producer, and
so this is many years later.
Well, no, I moved fast. I got out of the Army in 1958, and a year later I was working in that press office. And in the summer of 1961, I was working at Bucks County Playhouse. I got a job for the summer there. And Mike Ellis, the producer, said Alex Cohn, he and David Merrick were the 1 and 2 most prolific producers. And he said, Alex has decided he wants... doesn't want to have publicists who are freelancing. He wants somebody in his office to handle all his shows. And all the established people aren't going to give up their business. So he's interviewing all the young people. And he thinks, and Mike Ellis said, I think you should go and have an interview with Alex. And he arranged it. And in the middle of the interview, Alex said, I want to hire you. And years later, he told me it was something that I said that he made that calculated choice. And so I ended up working for him on all the first show was Beyond the Fringe, but then
Well, Beyond the Fringe was an import. I actually had seen it before because I was in school in London in 1960-61, and that was it was just one of the most thrilling theater experiences.
You just gave an indication of the smart aleck part of people in the entertainment field. Opening nights, people say, oh, haven't you seen it yet? And they say, oh, I saw it in London, or at London. They say, haven't you seen it yet? Oh, at the Edinburgh Festival.
I was just a poor student, and
They started at the Edinburgh Festival, but the 4 guys came. I didn't know that a show was going to run for 3 years, and they wonderful Alan Bennett and Dudley Moore and Peter Cook and
they all
Jonathan
went on to
Miller.
fame.
Oh, and it was wonderful working with them. But Alex said to me one day, there was a movie being made in London and Rome at the time called Cleopatra. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton both married to other people, and there was no E! channel in those days, but whispers were coming back that there's more happening on the set than a trip up the Nile. And it was reported that both Elizabeth and Richard had dumped. He was married to, what was it? Sybil Burton. Sybil Burton, who had gone through all of his affairs, and he always came back. And she was married to Eddie Fisher, so understandably she left him. And then they went to Puerto Vallarta, where he was to make Night of the Iguana after they finished Cleopatra, at which point Alex Cohn said to me, we're doing Hamlet, John Gielgud's directing, Richard Burton starring, and you have to handle the press. And we're looking at in this obscure town in Mexico, and the media is all over the place because Richard and Elizabeth were. It was like, I don't know, there's no comparable couples, and they had talent besides. So they came to Toronto for the rehearsals because we thought the paparazzi would be too crazy in New York. And I arrived at the hotel the day I arrived, and it was being picketed by the Legion of Decency because this was 1963. Richard and Elizabeth were living in sin and had not yet married each other. And they had to clear out the dining room because I was to have lunch with Richard, Elizabeth, John Gielgud, and Alex Cohn to meet them all and talk about the handling the press. And after we talked about some of the interviews that I had set up for Richard, they started talking about production. And Elizabeth said to me, this is Elizabeth Taylor, everyone. Certainly, the beauty has never been captured. Cat on a Hot Tin Roof does a pretty good job of it. She said, oh, honey, they don't need us. Let's go sit over there. So they had emptied out the dining room, and I'm having lunch with Elizabeth Taylor. And the most curious thing, and I was very aware of it, that she was other-oriented. She wanted to know, who are you? Where did you come from? I was 26 and I looked 12. She said, how'd you get this job? And where did you go to school? And where are you from? And she said, I'm here. Richard's in it. I have nothing to do all day. You're going to be hanging around? I said, yeah. She said, can we hang out? She said, I can't go out, This is all new for Richard because he was always able to bar hop. She said, I grew up with this. I'm confined. So I said, oh, all right. And
you gave in.
I gave in.
And spent the day with Elizabeth Taylor.
No, we would hang out around the hotel and opening night. But they had gotten married in Montreal, and she asked if I would be her date opening night because Richard was on stage. So, yes, I had a date. I always like to say I'm one of the men that dated Elizabeth Taylor that she didn't marry.
I'm speaking with David.
I liked her too. She was very nice. And years later, remember when Rock Hudson died, and she called Reagan and said, "You have to deal with the issue of AIDS." I wasn't surprised because she was an activist.
She must have been a saint, having been married to Eddie Fisher. I spent some time with Eddie Fisher, and he was one of the weirdest people I've ever been with.
But she dated me, and that was a good side of her.
I'm with David Rothenberg, and we're talking about his life. And now we come to an important moment in your life, a turning point. Yeah. When did John Herbert's play Fortune in Men's Eyes enter the picture?
Yeah, nobody grows up saying, I want to become an advocate for formerly incarcerated men and women. It was not in my plan. I met a drama critic in Toronto, a Toronto star named Nathan Cohen. And whenever he came to New York, he'd call me. He was very erudite. He was sort of the Alexander Woollcott of Canadian critics. And I loved meeting with him because he was a curmudgeon and he had insight about everything. And he said to me, he was taking me to a brunch at the Plaza. And he said, I've been given a script of a play that nobody will do in Canada. Maybe you can get somebody to do it. And he sent me this play, Fortune in Men's Eyes. And I said, Nathan, you haven't liked anything since Potemkin. I'm interested. So I remember sitting in bed at night reading this play, and when it was all over, I was devastated. And I read it again, and I called John Herbert and said, I want to see if I can get this play on.
He'd been imprisoned, and hadn't he been sentenced to prison mostly because the judge thought he was gay?
Yes. Well, he was epicene, if that's the word.
So he was rather effeminate.
He was raped his first night in prison, and gang raped. And this play is about a kid who comes into jail and is raped. And when I read it, the thing that startled me is not only that I was not aware of it, but I was angry at myself as one who considered himself politically active and socially aware, that this was it was Mars to me. It was so alien. And when I met John and found out it was his story, and that it's the story of kids that go into jail, I said, people have to hear this story, and was determined. I gave the play to several producers, and they all said, well, it's a good play, but nobody wants to see a play about a kid getting raped. And so
So you took out a loan?
I took out a bank loan. In those days, the production cost, you had to raise $15,000. The same play today would cost about $750,000. And I raised about $8,000 and came to a stand and couldn't. People just didn't think this is a great financial investment. And I took out a bank loan to get it on. And in rehearsal, the actors, the four young men, said that they wanted to go to a prison to validate what they were trying to interpret as, which is what actors do. And we arranged for a trip to Rikers Island. It was December of December of '66, my first visit to a jail, and I was traumatized. One of the actors, Victor Arnold, had the same reaction. All I saw was young kids. We were in the juvenile section. I saw young kids being herded about. And then we went into the dorms, and they were sitting there vacant. Joanne Page, who's the CEO at Fortune, years later referred to it as death by boredom. And when I came out, there was somebody from backstage wanted to talk to us about what it all, what this meant. And I said then that this is an exercise in futility. Whatever those kids are in there for, whatever brought them into Rikers, how are they going to be better when they come out? And that was an instinct that I had. And I have been in jails and prisons throughout the country and have never altered that feeling. I've been to Angola in Louisiana, and I was in New Mexico after the big riot into solitary confinement, and you see are eyes that are glazed. Well, and
of course you were at Attica, and we'll get to that in a little bit as well.
Then the play opened to Wiley. You have to ask the question.
I was surprised to see that it got some raves, and then it got mixed reviews. The Times and some other papers weren't sure that they liked it. Do you think it had to do with the theme?
Well, it was very funny.
Because it's a very powerful play.
Powerful play. The funny thing is, Dan Sullivan, who was then a second-string critic, was dismissive of it. Clive Barnes, who later became the critic at the Times, was then the dance critic. And years later, when Sal Mineo did a revival, we got our first rave. He said it lacked the power and breadth of the original production. I said, God, Clive, 3 years too late. But I remember Jerry, when the Times review came out, we thought, well, we're finished. And then ABC called it powerful. In those days, television critics actually reviewed off-Broadway plays. And the next morning, I called the box office to see if they had anything, and the line was busy, and then busy, and then busy. And when I finally got through, he said, I can't talk, David. It's too many people here. So I raced down to the theater. And apparently it hit a nerve with people. And then Jerry Talmer in the Post compared it with De Seeker's Bicycle Thief. And Michael Smith in the Village Voice did a full-page review saying that the rage that some critics had should be reserved for the reality that the play reflected, and that the anger should be at what we're doing to young people in our juvenile institutions, not a play that mirrors it. And that changed things.
Although we're still talking about that as a problem.
Needless to say, because times people, new generations come along and discover things. But what happened was a teacher at St. John's called me and said, I'm bringing 20 students. Can we stay for a dialogue after the performance? Well, that was right up my political activist. Mm-hmm. I had been in the civil rights demonstrations and anti-war demonstrations, and here was an arena that was by itself. And so we invited the entire audience to stay, and this was pivotal. The audience was very complimentary. The actors are wonderful. And then some man challenged it and said, this play is an exaggeration. I can't believe it. And from the back of the house, a man stood up and said, not if my 20 years in joints like this counts for anything. You couldn't watch what happens to us. And so I said, come on, like Johnny Olson, come on down. And Pat McGarry came down, and he waxed eloquently for about an hour, talking about Rikers and Clinton and the Florida chain gang that he had been in the 40s. And afterwards we went out for coffee, and I said, Pat, people have to hear this. You have to come back. And he said, at the Limelight across the street from the Actors Playhouse, I did white time. You have to get a black guy. And I said, what do you mean white time? And there's white time and black time? And he said, exactly. I said, in New York now? And he said, yes. I said, you're the only guy I know. And he said, I'm working in a tailor shop. I have a customer. I'm sure he did time. And he came back the following week with a man named Clarence Cooper, African-American, who had done time in Milan, Michigan. And the two of them, it was central casting because Pat was flamboyant and outrageous, and Clarence was an intellectual and intense and had a concealed rage. And together, they mesmerized the audience. And so as a good publicist, I called Cy Peck at the New York Times and said, send a reporter down, and he did. And the headline said, the drama continues after the curtain falls. And we were doing this on Tuesday nights. And the following Tuesday night, in the audience during the discussion, about a dozen guys introduced themselves as men who had done time and had read the story. And what I learned, and they started coming every week, the same guys. It was almost therapeutic. And what I learned is that I think all of them were in AA, and that by maintaining sobriety, they were maintaining their freedom, but their rage about the prison system had not been dealt with.
How long after that did you decide to come up with the Fortune Society, which was a much more modest idea at the beginning?
It was going to be my Kiwanis Club. What happened was people, what I like to say is this was the late 60s when you didn't have to apologize for caring and people got involved in social and political issues. And I started getting calls from people saying, I was in the audience Tuesday night at that discussion. Could you come with a couple of those guys? Because a lot of these guys were surfacing from the audience. And so suddenly I was on the circuit. Going to colleges and classrooms and churches with 2 or 3 men. And I keep saying men because it was a couple of years before any women came forward, double standard and all sorts of reasons.
But did they, when they finally came, did they have equally horrific stories to tell?
Oh, yeah. And the adjustment and reentry was with all sorts of double standards. You know, a guy who did a lot of time and put herself together, isn't that admirable? But as Fran O'Leary, who was the first woman who spoke a lot, after a few months, she said to me, I can't do it anymore. And I said, why, Fran? She said, because the guys, you're a stand-up guy, but once a slut, always a slut. And I said, then talk about that, Fran. Try that. Talk about the double standard, which she did. But going back, when we were going on the circuit, it was just a group of people. I still had my theater office. I was representing Hair as a publicist and the boys in the band and Fortune in Men's Eyes and a Harold Pinter play and an Edward Albee play.
You were big time.
I was it. I was the man. And my office is where guys were hanging out who had done time. And they all loved Hair because I got them in. You know. But after about 7 or 8 weeks of that and going on the circuit, one night at the theater, I said, we have the nucleus of an organization. We could educate the public and change perception about what prison does to people through your stories. Your stories are powerful, and you guys are examples of what people... You erase all the stereotypes because you're smart and you're funny and you're charming and you did time.
So did you imagine it, initially envision it as an educational service?
Yes, but I had, Fortune is so incredible now. I had people say, what was your vision? I said, to get through the day. That's what it was. Well, I never thought I was going to give up my theater work.
Someone joked that when you get out of prison in New York, you get $40, a bologna sandwich, and 2 tickets to Alvin Ailey.
Yeah, well...
That's because Alvin Ailey was one of the supporters of the Fortune Society at the beginning?
Way before that, when that first year in the theater, going back, that summer that I was hired, my boss said, they're doing a summer tour of Jamaica. Lena Horne had been starring on Broadway, and Abby Lincoln is doing the tour. And some kid in the chorus is directing it. Go meet him and set up some pictures with. And I went in, and there was this man, and I'm David Rothenberg. He said, I'm Alvin Ailey. And we set the pictures, and he was bright and funny and charming and all of that. And we went out and had coffee afterwards and had lunch, and we talked about what do you want to do when you grow up, And Alvin said, I want to do this. And we stayed in touch, and we were friends. And when Fortune started, he was so supportive of me and what we were doing. And when we set up an advisory council, Alvin was on it, and he always made sure that 10 tickets were available for guys from Fortune. So Kenny Jackson one day said, when you come out of prison in New York, you get $40, a bologna sandwich, and 2 tickets to Ailey.
You also helped by an appearance on David Susskind's TV talk show.
Many times. On which subject?
The
coming out or the criminal justice?
Well, we'll come to the coming out later, but criminal justice, this suddenly became what was driving you.
Well,
was it affecting your other work?
Well, what happened is, because I was a good publicist, I called Gene Kennedy at the Susskind show and said, "You've never done a program with guys who have done time." Susskind in those days was like Oprah became. Everybody watched it. There were only 6 channels, and it's Sunday night at 11 o'clock.
He was Dick Cavett and Oprah together, in a way.
And so 4 guys from Fortune went on Susskind, and 2 hours. And, before then, before Fortune started, people who had done time weren't visible because you could lose your job, your housing. You had lied to relatives, 4 years working down south on a farm. No, you were upstate in a prison in New York. And so at the end of the program, Susskind said, these men, the 4 guys that were on, including Clarence Cooper, were part of a new organization called the Fortune Society, and he put 1545 Broadway. And we thought we'd get a lot of calls for speaking engagements because that's what we were doing. And when I arrived at my office the next day, which was on the 6th floor, the stairwell from the top floor to the bottom was filled with guys just out of prison looking for jobs, housing. And I'm sitting there with my theater posters not knowing what to do with them.
Well, that is where the story goes in just a few moments.
I can't swear.
But I wanted to ask you, because around this time you also started doing broadcasts on WBAI.
Where is that?
Was that related to what you
30 East 39th Street was our first BAI's first place, and I think Arthur Seidelman had me on as a guest when the play was starting, and then somebody suggested I do a program that was both sides of the bars, where we would have somebody, a formerly incarcerated person, and somebody from the system. And I did that for 4 years, first there, then at the church.
My guest on Leonard Lopate at Large is David Rothenberg. We're talking about his wide-ranging career in theater and then as the founder of the Fortune Society. So these young men came looking for housing and jobs. And you weren't somebody who would have known how to do
nothing.
All of
Didn't
those.
know any of it. And I was a theater person who was arranging for guys to speak. I can't say one of the 7 words, but one of the guys standing there with a toothpick in his mouth, Kenny Jackson, walked over to me and said, "You don't know what the F you're doing." And he said, "Move over," and he sat down. He literally became the first counsel there. He said, "I'm a drunk. We keep each other out of trouble by staying sober and talking about it." And he became the first counselor there. And later that day, a guy named Mel Rivers out of Bed-Stuy came in. And Kenny was white and Mel was black, and they hit it off right away. And they understood the potential of it, and they understood immediately it had to be a black and white thing or they weren't going to deal with the issue.
You began publishing something called the Fortune News,
Yes.
a monthly newsletter with articles written primarily by people with justice histories. Didn't some prisons try to ban it?
They all banned it. And it was a pathetic little...
And why did they ban it?
Lenny, it was a mimeograph sheet. Do you remember mimeograph machines?
Yes.
I mean, before all these modern things, this is a thing you just rolled out, and it was a 3-page thing talking about where we were speaking and little profiles on some of the guys. And it was the late 60s, early 70s. Everything that was calling for change or for a new population was... We knew that we were infiltrated. We knew that there were... what is it? Quid pro? Not what is it called? The people.
It's not quid pro
not
quo.
Quid pro quo. Whatever that group.
That means trading.
No, I know the phrase begins with a C. They came.
COINTEL.
COINTEL people. Yeah, we found out there were people saying they had done time, and
no,
they
but
weren't.
of course, 1968 was a revolutionary year. So you were just part of.
They thought we were
a lot
crazy.
of other stuff that was happening.
I mean, people who had done time having a voice, and so the prisons banned it. And we had a law student named Steve Shostakowski from Columbia who took the case to court, and we won in the federal courts. And so the inmates...
Well, the case said prisons couldn't deny reading literature to individuals who were incarcerated. So it was much broader than just your newsletter.
It's still the law, and they still ignore it. We have to keep telling people in different parts of the country, get a copy of Fortune versus McGinnis. But we suddenly had great credibility with inmates, and I was getting inundated with mail from Attica particularly, two guys, Herbert X. Blyden and Roger Champa, who would emerge as leaders in the uprising that happened in September of 71, were in constant correspondence with me, telling me about the conditions there, and I was writing back and getting information. And when the riot jumped off, that's what you leading to, right?
Actually, I was wondering about another thing, but I want to get to the riots as well. So why don't we talk about that? I can always backtrack.
Yeah, well, when the riot jumped off, and Arthur Reeve, an assemblyman from Buffalo, called me and said the inmates have taken hostages, and which we knew. It was lead news story around the world.
And you and a number of other people were invited to be civilian witnesses?
He said, you're on the list. Inmates have been, the prisoners have said they don't trust the state in the negotiations, and they want outsiders to come in. Will you come into the yard? And Arthur Reeve was going in too. And I said, I will, but I'm not going up there alone. And Kenny Jackson, Mel Rivers, and I were flown to Buffalo, and the state troopers picked us up. And Kenny said, it's the first time I've been in a police car without handcuffs on me. And we were brought into the yard.
This guy was obviously very witty.
The laughter at Fortune has continued for 51 years. Somebody said, what is the special ingredient? And I said, laughter. If you can create a place where people can laugh, anything is possible.
And the fact that you were there and witnessed it and made it in the newspapers, didn't that lead to the growth of the Fortune Society?
Yeah, we were the only game in town then for the media. So, I mean, and we had guys who had done time in Attic, and everybody was there, and we were testifying and being on interviews and all of that.
And I was wondering what you think of the current efforts of sentencing and prison reform. President just signed a bill.
Well, which affects some federal prisoners. I have to say something nice about Trump. It's the best thing he did, and it's Jared Kushner, whose father did federal time, which is why Christie is not in the administration, because Christie was the prosecutor. But yes, there's a lot of work still has to be done. Bail reform. Seniors being held way beyond being hit by the parole board over and over again. Parole boards.
Yeah, if people get life without parole and they're 85 years old, they are absolutely no danger to anybody, society.
If only to themselves. And parole boards, sadly, are an elephant's graveyard for retired prosecutors and sheriffs. And there has to be governors have to appoint a more diverse group of people to assess. And in New York now, you go before the parole board and you do it on a video. That they're not there with you. Your humanity doesn't exist. It's all based on dehumanizing people. At Fortune we meet hundreds every month coming out, and the reentry is an arduous process to undo the damage that's been done. The prison experience is so damaging because most people don't confront the demons that put them there. They have to learn how to survive in that strange atmosphere. So when they come out, they have two things. They have to undo, or as one man said, Larry White said, I had to put on all these coats of survival. And when I came out, I had to learn how to take them off. And then you have to begin dealing with what were the things that got you in there, because that's really dealt with in prison.
And I imagine also have to deal in many cases with PTSD. Which never gets discussed here. We think about it with returning soldiers.
Yes.
But is the Fortune News still being published? I imagine it's no longer on a mimeograph.
No, it's a very sophisticated publication now.
Now, in the early days of the AIDS epidemic, didn't you start receiving letters from inmates with reports of men dying from this strange illness?
Well, I remember one letter from a guy in Attica who I'd been in correspondence with, who said there's a danger because a guy in the kitchen that works in the kitchen has been identified with AIDS, and people won't eat. And there was, as was everywhere, a lot of misinformation about AIDS. So I called Marty Horn, who was in a deputy commissioner and one of the bright lights in the field, and he said, can you get me some literature? And I got the Gay Men's Health Crisis which was the only game in town then, and we sent it to Marty, and he called me 3 days later, and he said, the wardens won't let anything in with the word gay in it. You never underestimate how stupid they can be. So I went.
And did they give a reason for that? Did it have to be homosexual?
No, they don't. They don't. That's the thing about correction. They do what they do because they can. Families get frustrated because if their son is in one prison, the rules are on packages and visits are one way, and they learn what they are, and then the loved one is transferred to another institution. Then the rules are all different because they want to. But what happened with the AIDS thing is I went back to the Gay Men's Health Crisis and said, can you print some literature without the word gay in it and just put your initials? And that's what got in to help guys understand what it was.
Has that ever been resolved? Can you say gay now in literature in prison?
I think so. I think they know what it is.
Well, so...
And they wouldn't give out condoms inside because there's no sex inside.
Theoretically, right? So you did this show on BAI.
I did.
About prison and related matters.
For about 4 years.
And then you left, or...
I was let go. Can I tell the horror tale?
Of course.
I arrived one day with a guest, and they said, "Oh, you're not on." I said, "Oh, you preempted me," and they said, "Yeah, for good, you're off." That's how. That was my introduction to BAI reality. So after 4 years of doing a show weekly, I was not on. But then I kept getting calls to be a guest. Mm-hmm. And then Samori Marksman came in and he called and he said, I want you on. And I said, I don't want to do a criminal justice show. I want to be Martin Block and play music, because I thought if I played music with the people that I like who sing and then talk about the social and political issues, I'd have a wider audience instead of just talking to the choir.
And that's how Any Saturday was born.
Well, it was called Any Wednesday at first. But what happened, we had a different host every morning back in those days, and I was Wednesday. I think Fred Hershkowitz was Thursday. Richard Barr was Tuesdays. Diane Lacey was Mondays, something like that. Mm. And but what's the point of the question? What happened then?
Yeah.
I was going.
And you were given permission to just do whatever you wanted to do.
Yeah, and I was on from 7 to 9 and then going to work. And I was aging, and I suddenly realized you can't do a radio show for 2 hours and then do an 8-hour job stint and then cover shows at night or whatever it was I was doing. And so I said, I would like to continue, but Shabbos with David, and they switched me to Saturdays.
Uh-huh. But pretty much the same show.
Yeah.
But Saturday probably was a better time slot for the kind of show that you were doing.
Well, I can collapse after.
No, I was thinking more of the kinds of things that you were covering. But it was a combination of social and political commentary, comedy, reminiscences, interviews, and then also
movie
theater.
And play reviews.
Yeah.
And book reviews and talking to authors, which I love.
So it was whatever you felt like doing that.
Whatever struck my fancy. Uh-huh. Like this Saturday, I'll be talking to Kiernan O'Reilly, one of the co-directors of the Irish Repertory Theatre, because they're doing a whole season of O'Casey, which thrills me because I love the plays of Sean O'Casey. The following week, I'm going to interview an author named Joe Finder, who's written an explosive novel called Judgment.
Joseph Finder.
Which is a lot about Russian oligarchs laundering money with American corporations.
Ooh.
Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, well, he's also, I know I interviewed him years ago. He's a very good writer.
Is he a good interview?
Yeah.
I've never met him. The book is excellent.
And then you got into politics.
I did run for office in '85, city council.
And
blessedly lost.
Well, you actually got a lot of votes.
I did.
But it was just that you were in the wrong district?
I ran against a 16-year incumbent. I got 45%. I won in Chelsea in the Village and lost a long strip on the Upper East Side because Ed Koch campaigned vigorously for my opponent. He was mayor at the time.
And that's interesting because you were an openly gay candidate, and
the first.
We do know now that Ed Koch was gay.
Well, I know. Assume. I don't know what you know. I know that he is.
Well, there have been a number of eyewitness reports.
Well, it's in my book, so I can tell that. You want me to tell you the story? When Ed was in Congress and planning and thinking about running for mayor, and he was a very progressive congressman. In fact, he was Fortune's point person. He and John Conyers from Michigan, the two congressmen we would call about federal prison things. Ed was living on Washington Place at the time, and every Sunday night would have a potluck supper and invite all the young people many of whom went on to be figures known in his administration, John LaCicero and Mary Parrott Nichols. And I became very friendly with a guy who was very political, and was the deputy commissioner of health in the Beam administration, named Richard Nathan. And one night we were all at Ed's, and people were, everybody brought their casseroles and their salads and cleaned up afterwards. And Richard and I were cleaning up. This is the real dirt part, everybody. Richard and I were cleaning up in the kitchen, and I said, "It looks like everybody's leaving, Richard. I'm out of here." And he said, "David, I'll walk you home." Across Washington Square Park, and as we were going to leave, Ed said, "Oh, Richard, stay." And Richard said, "No, I really have to go, Ed. I'll call you later." So we're walking across the park, and I looked at Richard, and I said, "What am I, chopped liver?" And he said, "What?" And I said, "Who says Richard stay with two people standing there? What's that all about?" And he said, "Well, I'm having a relationship with the congressman." And I thought, he's running for mayor. He's in Congress. This is 70-something. This is 77 or 6. I thought, God, Ed is crazy. He's living a closeted life. And during the campaign, if you remember that far back, during the campaign, Ed Koch discovered Bess Meyerson's pinky, and they were holding it wherever they went. She was the beard during the campaign. And Richard Nathan said to me at the insiders party the day after the day that Ed won, there was the big celebration, and then the party at Arthur Schwartz's house where the inside people came. And Richard said to me, "I've been told I'm out of here. I'm leaving. It's been made clear to me." And he moved to California, set up his own.
He'd been replaced.
His own consulting business. No, he was an embarrassment to Ed. So years later, at a health conference, do you want more on this?
Yeah, sure.
Years later, at a health conference in California, apparently Larry Kramer saw Richard Nathan. They did one of those, "Oh, I know you from New York, who do you know?" And they had lunch, and they both knew me. And Richard then told Larry Kramer he was the much secreted lover of Ed Koch, which was like telling Dorothy Kilgallen, because Larry Kramer hated Ed Koch because of Ed's response to the AIDS crisis. Larry came back to New York. He has a different version of this. He said that Richard wanted it. Richard said no. Larry Kramer comes back to New York and calls all the press and says, "I can give you the name of Ed Koch's lover, and the person who was there to witness it and can validate it is David Rothenberg." And I arrive at my office the next day, and it's like a bad old movie. They're all asking me what's going on. And I stonewalled them because while I was angry at Koch because of his move to the right politically, I didn't want to out him. And he was in a primary for the third term at that time with David Dinkins. And the interesting thing is that Giuliani was then the Southern District prosecutor, and had subpoenaed Richard Nathan in from California because apparently Richard had gotten a very small consultant fee on a project in New York City. And Giuliani was going to use that, was going to smear Koch by exposing Richard Nathan, but he couldn't because David Dinkins defeated Ed in the primary. And that's and that there is the truth.
Koch should have hired Giuliani as his lawyer.
Have you been watching him?
It's
an embarrassment. He's like the uncle you hide in the attic that you don't want anybody to see. He's crazy.
Well, but he, when I worked at WNYC for
I knew you
for
looked familiar.
a
That's
long
right.
time, the city owned the station.
Yeah.
And when he was mayor, if I had a certain guest that he didn't like, he would send questions over to his whoever, I forgot the name of the guy he had appointed to head the station, and that would be passed on to me. So when Alphonse D'Amato came on my show, and they had a notorious, infamous feud.
Oh, I know that. Oh,
yeah, well, I just ignored the questions. I figured I wasn't going to be fired for not reading the questions that Giuliani sent.
But he got questions that you had to ask a guest.
That he thought would embarrass Alphonse D'Amato. But it's interesting, when you ran for office, you were endorsed by the Daily News.
Yeah.
The Village Voice, the Amsterdam News. I'm sure they were appreciative of what you were doing for ex-cons, especially African-American ex-cons.
The phrase, Leonard, formerly incarcerated.
Yes. Meanwhile, You have the Fortune Society now has a project called the Castle.
Oh, it's a residence. It's been there 16 years. I'll be leaving here to go to the Thursday night meeting, which I go to every Thursday, a community meeting of the residents and people from the executive team.
This is an impressive 5-story neo-Gothic building in Harlem, 140th Street and Riverside Drive, and it's where it's run as kind of a halfway house.
No, that's not the phrase. It's a place where people reclaim their lives. Halfway houses are shelters, and they're usually halfway back in because the shelters are so horrible. But at the Fortune Academy, the Castle, staffed by formerly incarcerated people, it's about people wanting something better in their life. As one man said, I always knew there was something else. I just didn't know where to find it.
Do you think that public attitudes are changing? For example, in Florida, the voters now are allowing former felons to
vote. Yeah, and that's been all racist. And the whole history of drugs is at point of arrest, conviction, and sentencing, go after black people and then strip them of the right to vote. But what happens when things change? I think what Fortune's great gift has been is having put a face on people who have done time and erasing the stereotypes and allowing so many people to feel more comfortable with people that they would otherwise fear because of the labels. And that it's been emulated across the country, and room has been created for people to address their past.
You retired from your show business side. What about?
I'm retired from everything.
Really?
But I just keep coming in here.
Come into WBA.
Well, yes, and I go to the Castle every Thursday, and I do go to Fortune. I have an office at Fortune, and I go 2 or 3 days a week.
Do you miss the show business? Or has it changed so much? I'm just looking at what's on Broadway, and today, even the musicals, nobody's writing original musicals. It's all jukebox musicals.
Well, I'm looking for. There's some good plays that I'd like to see. I want to see The Choir Boy, and I want to see Every Man, and To Kill a Mockingbird. Theater is, goes. There are cycles, but. I went to a reading of a play last night. I was invited. It's written by a man whose father came out of prison, and it's about all the ups and downs of what happens to a family when somebody's returning. And it was funny, and it was rich, and it was a mirror of what happens. There's always somebody doing something that never write any institution off, because there's always some kid that's going to change things with his energy and his talent.
Have you retired from the Fortune Society?
Oh, no, I don't.
Well, you just said you retired from everything.
Well, they don't pay me. Nobody pays me anything, but I keep going. I'll be at the Castle tonight. I'll probably be at Fortune tomorrow morning, walking around trying to justify my existence.
And there have been a whole bunch of organizations that have come along since that were influenced by what happened with the Fortune Society.
People wanted us to be national in the early days, and my instinct was that every area has their own personality. And so I would say to people I remember North Carolina, come up and spend a few days with us and see what we do. And you are good thieves, steal what we do and bring it back to your community and make it work. And so there's a network of people around the country who stay in touch with each other. I have Joanne Page and Stanley Richards, who now run Fortune Society, and Sam Rivera, who runs the Castle. They're the ones that are actively involved. And I show up on Thursday nights, and they give me a pat. I'm the oldest person of every room I walk into, and they give me a pat and some encouragement.
But it makes sense for there to be local organizations, because each state has different rules and different laws concerning people who were formerly incarcerated.
Yeah, and the ethos,
some are punitive, and some are if somebody has been falsely incarcerated. Some states will give them a lot of money, and other states will not.
Well, you get a letter from people in South Dakota, and the issue is mostly Native Americans who are locked up, who have their own specific set of problems that they have to deal with locally. And we give them encouragement and guidance, and they come and visit us and see what we do and pick what's applicable for them.
We have no more time left, but if people want to help out with the Fortune Society, where did they go?
FortuneSociety.org.
That simple. Okay. Yeah. David Rothenberg, thank you so much for
Lenny
being on our show.
Lopate, thank you for letting me share this mic with you.
And that brings us to the end of today's show. My great thanks to David Rothenberg, to Reggie Johnson, who was at the audio controls, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music, and to my executive producer, Jesse Lent. Leonard Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.